Before there was Al Capone, there was the man who taught him how to smile while he killed you. Before Chicago knew his name, before the Tommy gun became his signature, before Scarface became a legend whispered in fear across an entire nation, there was a narrow street in Brooklyn, a candy shop that wasn't really a candy shop, and a Sicilian immigrant with cold eyes and an undertaker's calm who ran the whole show. His name was Frankie Yale. And this is a story America has almost forgotten, the story of the mentor who built a monster, and the monster who, one afternoon in July of 1928, sent that mentor home in a coffin, riddled with bullets from the very weapon Yale never saw coming, the machine gun, fired from a moving car, for the very first time on American soil. This is not just the story of how Al Capone became Al Capone. This is the story of the man who came first. The man who ran Brooklyn's underworld like a general runs an army. The man who could order a murder over breakfast and be home in time for dinner with his wife and daughter. The man who built an empire out of bootleg whiskey, extortion, and blood, and who, in the end, discovered that the deadliest thing he ever did was teach his student too well. Stay with me. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why they say in the underworld, there is no loyalty. Only leverage. And leverage always runs out. Before we descend into the shadows of 1900s Brooklyn, I want to know where in the world you're watching this from, and what time it is right there, right now. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and it means more than you know to see this story reaching people across the globe, at every hour of the day and night. If you're new here, welcome to the shadows. This channel is dedicated to telling the real, cinematic, deeply researched stories of organized crime's most powerful, and most forgotten, figures. Hit subscribe, because we are just getting started, and the story of Frankie Yale is one of the darkest, bloodiest, and most important gangster stories never properly told. Now, let's begin. The story of Frankie Yale doesn't begin with gunfire. It begins with silence, the particular silence of a family standing on the deck of a ship, watching a shoreline they will never see again disappear into the gray Atlantic mist. Somewhere in that crowd of tired, hopeful, frightened faces was a small boy named Francesco Iole, born in 1893 in the town of Longobucco, a rugged, poverty-stricken village tucked into the mountains of Calabria, in the toe of Italy's boot. Longobucco was not a place that gave much to its children beyond hard soil, hard winters, and an inheritance of hunger passed down through generations. Families there did not dream of comfort. They dreamed of survival. And when survival at home became impossible, they did what millions of Italians did in that era, they crossed an ocean toward a country that promised opportunity, and delivered, more often than not, a different kind of hardship altogether. The Iole family settled in Brooklyn, New York, in a neighborhood that would come to define young Francesco's entire life, a tangle of tenement buildings, pushcart markets, gambling dens, and back-alley violence known simply as South Brooklyn. If Longobucco had been poor, South Brooklyn was poor in a different way, crowded, loud, dangerous, a place where 100 different immigrant tribes were crushed together into blocks meant for a fraction of their number, all of them fighting for the same scraps of the American dream. For a boy like Francesco, school was a luxury quickly abandoned. Formal education in the Italian immigrant tenements of early 1900s Brooklyn was, for many families, considered secondary to survival. Children worked. They ran errands, they sold newspapers, they shined shoes, they carried messages for men who paid better than any legitimate employer ever would. And in neighborhoods like South Brooklyn, those men were rarely running legitimate businesses. By the time Francesco was a teenager, he had already begun to understand something that would define the rest of his life: the neighborhood ran on two currencies. The first was money. The second, and, in many ways, more valuable, was fear. The boys who could inspire fear didn't need to beg for the first currency. It came to them. He was not a large man by build, not in the way we picture gangsters in the movies, broad-shouldered giants who fill a doorway. Francesco Iole, who would soon adopt the name that history remembers him by, Frankie Yale, was of average height, stocky, with a face that could shift in an instant from a warm, disarming smile to something far colder. That duality, charm on the surface, ice underneath, would become his signature. Men who worked for Yale often said the same thing about him in later years: he could laugh with you over a glass of wine and order your death in the same conversation, without so much as a change in his tone of voice. It's worth pausing here to understand the world that shaped him, because Frankie Yale did not invent the underworld of South Brooklyn, he was a product of it, sharpened by it, and eventually, he came to dominate it. At the turn of the century, Italian immigrant neighborhoods across America's eastern cities were plagued by a particular criminal phenomenon that terrified both the immigrant communities themselves and the wider American public: the Black Hand. This wasn't a formal organization in the way people often imagine. There was no single, Black Hand, boss issuing orders from a hidden lair. Rather, it was a method, a style of crime, practiced by countless independent extortionists across Italian neighborhoods in New York, Chicago, New Orleans, and beyond. The method was brutally simple. A shopkeeper, a landlord, a tradesman, anyone with money or the appearance of money, would receive a letter. The letter would demand payment, often signed with a black handprint or a crude drawing of a dagger or a skull, and it would threaten violence, kidnapping, arson, even murder, against the recipient or their family if the money wasn't paid. For a boy growing up in this environment, the Black Hand wasn't some distant myth. It was daily life. It was the backdrop against which every business transaction, every friendship, every family relationship played out. And for ambitious, hungry young men without other paths to power, men who had no interest in decades of backbreaking factory labor for pennies, extortion offered a shortcut. It offered exactly what the neighborhood respected most: fear, and the money that fear could buy. Francesco Iole was one of these young men. Some accounts suggest he began his criminal career as little more than a street tough, running with local gangs, picking fights, learning the geography of violence the way other boys learned the geography of baseball diamonds. He learned which alleys offered escape routes. He learned which police officers could be paid off and which couldn't. He learned that reputation, once established, did half the work for you, that a man known to be dangerous rarely had to prove it more than once or twice, because word traveled fast on streets that thrived on gossip and fear in equal measure. It was sometime during this period of his young adulthood that Francesco Iole began going by a different name, Frankie Yale. Historians and biographers have offered different theories as to where the name came from. Some suggest it was simply an Americanized simplification that rolled off the tongue easier than Iole for the Irish and German cops and clerks he dealt with. Others suggest a more colorful, deliberate choice, an attempt to sound less foreign, less immediately identifiable as a member of the Italian underworld the newspapers were increasingly demonizing. Whatever the reason, the name stuck, and it would be the name written in headlines, whispered in fear, and eventually carved into a tombstone. By his late teens, Frankie Yale was already a known quantity on the streets of South Brooklyn, not yet a boss, not yet an empire builder, but a young man clearly marked for something more than the ordinary. He had a quality that men who rise in organized crime almost always share: he understood people. He understood what motivated them, what frightened them, what they wanted to hear, and, most importantly, what they were willing to overlook if the money was good enough. This wasn't book intelligence. It was a street-honed, animal cunning, the kind that can't be taught in any classroom, the kind that either exists in a person or doesn't. He began working the extortion rackets himself, following the well-worn Black Hand playbook, but he brought something to it that many of the older, more traditional extortionists lacked: organization. Where many Black Hand criminals operated as lone wolves or loose, temporary alliances, prone to being picked off individually by police or rival criminals, Yale began to see the value in structure. In loyalty. In building something that could survive beyond a single successful shakedown. It was around this time, the early 1910s, that Yale started to build his first real base of operations, a modest establishment that would, within a few short years, become one of the most infamous addresses in the history of American organized crime. He purchased, or came to control, a bar and pool hall in Coney Island called the Harvard Inn. On the surface, it was an unremarkable dive, a place for dockworkers, local toughs, and sailors on leave to drink cheap liquor, play pool, listen to music, and occasionally start a fight. But underneath that surface, the Harvard Inn was something else entirely, a headquarters. A recruiting ground. A place where Frankie Yale could sit, watch, and identify the next generation of talent the underworld would need. We will return to the Harvard Inn in detail later in this series, because it was within those walls that one of the most consequential meetings in American crime history would eventually take place, a meeting between Yale and a broad-shouldered, ambitious young man from an Italian-American family who would walk through those doors as a nobody, and walk out, years later, transformed into one of the most feared criminals the world has ever known. But that story comes later. For now, understand only this: Frankie Yale was building the stage before he knew who his star performer would be. What set Yale apart from the countless other minor black-hand extortionists and street toughs prowling Brooklyn in that era wasn't just ambition, it was patience, and a genuine gift for delayed gratification that was almost unheard of among young criminals eager for quick money and quicker reputations. Where lesser men wanted to be feared immediately, Yale wanted to be feared permanently. He understood, even as a young man, that violence used carelessly burns out fast, it draws police attention, it invites retaliation, it makes enemies faster than it makes money. Violence used strategically, on the other hand, sparingly but decisively, when the moment truly called for it, could build a reputation so fearsome that violence itself became almost unnecessary. Men would simply pay. Men would simply obey. Not because Yale was constantly demonstrating his willingness to kill, but because everyone understood, without needing reminders, exactly what he was capable of. This is the paradox that sits at the heart of every truly dangerous man in organized crime history, and Frankie Yale embodied it before almost anyone else in America fully understood the formula: the most feared men are rarely the loudest or the most visibly violent. They are the calm ones. The ones who smile while they talk business, who remember your children's names, who send flowers to funerals, including, sometimes, funerals of men they themselves ordered killed. Fear built on calm, calculated control lasts far longer than fear built on chaos and rage. By the time Frankie Yale reached his early 20s, he was no longer simply a promising young tough on the streets of South Brooklyn. He was becoming something else, a man other men in the underworld watched carefully, some with admiration, some with the particular wariness reserved for those you suspect will eventually surpass you. He had begun forming alliances with other rising figures in the Brooklyn underworld, learning the delicate, dangerous art of building coalitions without ever fully trusting anyone completely, a skill that would define his entire career, and one that, in a cruel irony history would later reveal, he would eventually fail to apply to the one relationship that mattered most. Because somewhere in this same world of pool halls, extortion rackets, and black hand letters, a young immigrant family from Naples was raising a son. A boy who was, at this point in our story, still just a child, restless, hot-tempered, physically imposing even at a young age, growing up not far from the very streets where Frankie Yale was building his reputation. That boy's name was Alphonse Capone. Their paths had not yet crossed. But Brooklyn, for all its sprawling tenements and crowded streets, was in many ways a small world, a world where ambitious, hungry young men eventually found their way to the same handful of places, the same handful of opportunities, the same handful of powerful men capable of opening doors that led either to riches or to early graves. Frankie Yale did not know it yet, sitting in the back room of the Harvard Inn, counting the weeks take from a string of successful shakedowns, planning his next move with the quiet, methodical confidence that had already begun to define him. But somewhere out there, in the crowded streets of Brooklyn, a boy was growing up who would one day walk through his doors, absorb every lesson he had to teach, and then, when the moment demanded it, use those very lessons to end his mentor's life. That is the tragedy at the heart of this story, and it is a tragedy that repeats itself, in different forms, across the entire history of organized crime. The men who build empires almost never anticipate that the empire's greatest threat will come not from a rival gang, not from the police, not from a federal prosecutor, but from the very student they trained with their own hands, in their own image, to be exactly as ruthless, exactly as calculating, exactly as dangerous as they themselves had become. Frankie Yale was, at this point in his young life, still climbing. Still building. Still, in some sense, innocent of the full weight of what his choices would eventually cost him. He had not yet become the president of a powerful criminal fraternal organization. He had not yet built a bootlegging empire worth millions of dollars. He had not yet stood as one of the most powerful gangsters in New York City, feared by police commissioners and courted by politicians who needed his neighborhood's votes. And he had not yet met the boy who would kill him. But all of that was coming. Brooklyn in the years just before Prohibition was a powder keg of ambition, poverty, violence, and opportunity, and Frankie Yale, cold-eyed and patient, was learning to strike every match with precision. Soon, a new law would sweep across America, one that would transform petty street extortionists into millionaires overnight, and transform quiet neighborhood toughs into kings of an underworld empire built on illegal whiskey and rivers of blood. The stage was being set. The empire was about to be born. And somewhere in the crowded, dangerous streets of Brooklyn, the boy who would inherit it all, and then destroy the man who built it, was waiting for his moment to walk through the door of the Harvard Inn. By the time Frankie Yale reached his early 20s, the streets of South Brooklyn had already given him an education no schoolroom could have offered. He understood leverage. He understood fear. He understood, better than most men twice his age, that power in the underworld was never simply seized, it was accumulated, brick by brick, favor by favor, threat by threat, until one day a man looked around and realized he no longer needed to ask permission for anything. That day was coming for Frankie Yale. But first, he had to survive the brutal, chaotic apprenticeship of the Black Hand years, a period so violent, so soaked in blood and fear, that entire Italian-American communities across the country lived under a kind of quiet siege for the better part of 2 decades. To understand what Frankie Yale was building, you first have to understand what he was building it out of. The Black Hand wasn't a gang in the way later generations would come to understand organized crime. There was no single boss, no unified structure, no hierarchy stretching from a penthouse office down through captains and soldiers. It was something rawer and, in some ways, more terrifying precisely because of its formlessness, a criminal method that spread like a disease through immigrant neighborhoods, practiced by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of independent operators who had discovered the same brutal truth: fear was profitable, and immigrant communities, distrustful of police who often didn't speak their language and were openly hostile to Italian newcomers, had nowhere else to turn. A shopkeeper who received a Black Hand letter demanding a payment of $500 had almost no good options. Going to the police often accomplished nothing. Many police departments in this era viewed Italian immigrants with open contempt, and investigations into Black Hand crimes were frequently slow, indifferent, or outright corrupt. Refusing to pay invited violence, a bombed storefront, a kidnapped child, sometimes a murder committed simply to demonstrate that the threat had never been idle. Paying, meanwhile, offered no permanent safety either. It simply confirmed to the extortionist that this particular victim was profitable, inviting a second letter, and a third, an endless bleeding of whatever wealth the victim had managed to accumulate through years of backbreaking labor. Frankie Yale entered this world not as an outsider looking to exploit a broken system, but as a young man who had grown up inside the wound itself, who understood intimately how fear moved through these neighborhoods, who spoke the language, who knew the families, who could sit in a kitchen drinking coffee with a terrified shopkeeper and understand exactly which words would extract compliance without requiring the theater of overt violence at all. This was, even at a young age, Yale's particular genius. Where cruder Black Hand operators relied on crude threats and clumsy bombings that drew unwanted police attention, Yale began to refine the art of extortion into something closer to a business transaction, cold, calm, almost professional in its execution. He began organizing. This is the detail that separates Frankie Yale from the hundreds of other young toughs who cycled through Brooklyn's underworld during this era and left no lasting mark on history. Most Black Hand extortionists worked alone or in small, temporary, unstable partnerships, arrangements built on mutual convenience rather than loyalty, prone to collapsing the moment money or ego got in the way. Yale understood, with a clarity that seemed almost unnatural for a man his age, that organization was the multiplier that turned petty crime into an empire. A single extortionist could shake down a handful of shopkeepers before either getting arrested, getting killed by a rival, or getting killed by an angry victim who decided fighting back was worth the risk. But a network, a coordinated group of men working under a single command structure, sharing intelligence, backing each other up, presenting a unified and inescapable front, could dominate an entire neighborhood, then a district, then eventually a borough. This was the seed of what would eventually become one of the most significant developments in the history of American organized crime, though few people at the time understood its full significance. Frankie Yale began building not just a gang, but an institution. And the vehicle he chose for this institution was, on paper, entirely legal, which was, in itself, a stroke of criminal genius. Yale became associated with, and eventually rose to lead, an organization called the Unione Siciliana, a fraternal society originally founded to provide mutual aid, insurance, and community support for Sicilian and Italian immigrants across the United States. On its surface, the Unione Siciliana was exactly what it claimed to be, a benevolent society, not unlike countless other ethnic fraternal organizations of the era, offering members life insurance, death benefits, and a sense of community solidarity in a country that often treated Italian immigrants as second-class citizens at best. But in city after city, the Unione Siciliana had also become deeply entangled with organized crime, its leadership positions coveted not for the modest legitimate benefits they offered, but for the extraordinary criminal opportunities they concealed. Control of the Unione Siciliana in a major city meant access to thousands of members, a built-in network of trust and obligation, a legitimate cover for moving money, and, perhaps most valuably, a recognized position of authority that commanded respect not just from criminals, but from ordinary immigrant families who saw the organization's leaders as pillars of the community. Frankie Yale's rise to the presidency of the Brooklyn chapter of the Unione Siciliana was, in many ways, the true turning point of his early career, the moment he transformed from a talented young extortionist into something resembling an underworld executive. The position gave him legitimacy. It gave him a title men could use without embarrassment, a title that appeared in community newspapers alongside his name in connection with charitable events and funeral processions, even as those same hands orchestrated extortion rackets, gambling operations, and, increasingly, acts of violence against rivals who threatened his growing territory. It's worth pausing here to talk about what made Frankie Yale genuinely dangerous, in a way that transcended simple physical intimidation. Many gangsters of this era relied almost entirely on raw violence and reputation, men who ruled through terror alone, whose organizations tended to be brittle, prone to collapse the moment their leader was killed, arrested, or simply grew old and lost his edge. Yale understood something more sophisticated. He understood that lasting power required legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it. He cultivated relationships not just with fellow criminals, but with local politicians, who needed the votes his neighborhoods could deliver. He cultivated relationships with police officers and precinct captains, some of whom found their monthly envelopes of cash considerably more persuasive than their oath to uphold the law. He cultivated relationships within the Italian-American community itself, positioning himself as a protector as much as a predator, a man who could be genuinely, sincerely generous to families in need, who paid for funerals, who found jobs for struggling immigrants, who settled neighborhood disputes with a wisdom that made him seem less like a criminal and more like an old-world patriarch dispensing justice. This duality wasn't hypocrisy, at least not in the way Yale himself likely understood it. In the world he inhabited, generosity and violence were not contradictions, they were simply two tools in the same toolkit, deployed depending on the situation. The shopkeeper who paid promptly and showed proper respect might find Yale extraordinarily generous in return, a benefactor who remembered his children's birthdays and quietly paid for medical bills during hard times. The shopkeeper who resisted, who went to the police, who tried to organize other victims against him, that shopkeeper discovered a very different side of the same man, a side capable of ordering violence with the same calm, unhurried tone he used to order a coffee. As Yale's reputation grew throughout the 1910s, so did his enterprises. He expanded beyond simple extortion into a broader portfolio of criminal activity that would become the standard template for organized crime bosses for the next century: gambling operations, running numbers rackets and card games throughout South Brooklyn, loan sharking, extending credit to desperate borrowers at ruinous interest rates enforced through violence rather than courts, labor racketeering, inserting himself and his associates into disputes between workers and employers on the Brooklyn waterfront, extracting payments from both sides in exchange for labor peace, and increasingly, control over various legitimate-seeming businesses that served as both genuine sources of income and convenient fronts for laundering the proceeds of less savory activities. Among these fronts, none would prove more historically significant than a modest establishment in Coney Island, the Harvard Inn. We touched on the Harvard Inn briefly in Part 1, but its importance to this story, and to the broader history of American organized crime, cannot be overstated, and it deserves a fuller telling here. On the surface, the Harvard Inn was an unremarkable saloon and dance hall catering to the rough, working-class crowds that filled Coney Island's amusement district during the booming years before Prohibition transformed the entire landscape of American nightlife. Sailors on leave, local dockworkers, small-time hoods looking for a drink and a card game, this was the clientele that filled the Harvard Inn on any given night, drawn by cheap liquor, live music, and the particular electric energy that Coney Island generated in that era, when it was one of the most vibrant entertainment districts in the entire country. But Frankie Yale did not run the Harvard Inn simply to sell beer. He ran it as a command post, a place where he could observe, in real time, the raw talent flowing through Brooklyn's underworld, and identify which young men possessed the particular combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and loyalty that made for valuable soldiers in his growing organization. Yale had learned, through his own rapid rise, that an organization was only as strong as the men willing to carry out its will, and that the most valuable of these men were rarely found through formal recruitment. They were found by watching, by testing, by putting opportunities in front of hungry young men and observing carefully how they responded. It was at the Harvard Inn, sometime in 1917 or 1918, that Frankie Yale hired a young bartender and bouncer, a broad-shouldered, quick-tempered teenager from a respectable but struggling Neapolitan immigrant family in the Navy Yard section of Brooklyn. This young man had already been expelled from school after striking a teacher, had already drifted into the orbit of a local street gang, and was, by every visible indication, exactly the kind of raw, unrefined material that Frankie Yale specialized in identifying and shaping. His name, as many of you watching already know, was Al Capone. We will spend significant time on the Capone relationship in Part 3, because it deserves its own full telling, the meeting, the mentorship, and the infamous incident that would leave Capone with the scars that gave him his nickname. But it's worth noting here, in the context of Yale's broader empire building during this period, just how emblematic the Capone hiring was of Yale's entire methodology. He was not simply running a bar. He was running a farm system, in the truest sense, a place where talent could be discovered, tested under low-stakes conditions, and gradually elevated into positions of greater trust and responsibility as loyalty was proven and skill was demonstrated. By the end of the 1910s, Frankie Yale stood as one of the most powerful and feared figures in the Brooklyn underworld, not yet a household name to the wider American public, not yet the subject of federal investigations or front-page newspaper headlines, but a man whose name commanded absolute respect and fear within the world that mattered most to him. He had built, through patience, calculation, and a willingness to use violence with surgical precision rather than reckless abandon, an organization that stretched across extortion, gambling, labor racketeering, and an increasingly sophisticated network of political and police protection. And yet, for all this accumulated power, Frankie Yale in 1919 was still, in many ways, a regional player, a formidable king of a relatively small kingdom. What transformed him from a powerful Brooklyn crime boss into one of the wealthiest and most influential gangsters in American history was not any scheme of his own devising, but a single piece of federal legislation that would reshape the entire criminal landscape of the United States almost overnight, the ratification of the 18th Amendment, and the passage of the Volstead Act, ushering in the era of Prohibition. Overnight, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages became illegal across the entire United States. And overnight, an enormous, previously legal industry, one that had employed hundreds of thousands of Americans, generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and satisfied a demand that showed no sign of actually diminishing simply because Congress had declared it illegal, was handed, gift-wrapped, to organized crime. For a man like Frankie Yale, who had spent the better part of a decade building precisely the kind of organization needed to exploit exactly this sort of opportunity, a network of loyal, disciplined men, established relationships with corrupt police and politicians willing to look the other way for the right price, existing distribution channels through gambling and labor rackets, and, crucially, no ethical hesitation whatsoever about breaking the law when the profit justified the risk. Prohibition wasn't a challenge to be navigated. It was, quite simply, the single greatest business opportunity of his lifetime, arriving at the exact moment he was positioned to seize it more effectively than almost any other criminal figure in New York City. The Black Hand years had been Frankie Yale's education. The Union Siciliana presidency had been his legitimacy. The Harvard Inn had been his recruiting ground. All of it, every extortion letter, every gambling den, every carefully cultivated relationship with a corrupt precinct captain, had been, whether Yale fully understood it at the time or not, preparation for the moment when America itself would hand him the keys to an empire. That empire was about to be built in earnest. And the young bartender he'd hired at the Harvard Inn, the hot-tempered boy with the quick fists and the sharp mind, was about to become an essential part of how Frankie Yale built it, and, eventually, the very man who would tear it all down. Every empire needs its foot soldiers, but only rarely does an empire find the one soldier who will eventually outgrow it entirely. In the story of Frankie Yale, that soldier walked through the doors of the Harvard Inn sometime around 1917, a teenager with restless hands and a temper that hadn't yet learned the discipline that would later make him one of the most feared men in America. His name was Alphonse Capone, and the story of how he came into Frankie Yale's orbit, and what happened to him inside that dance hall in Coney Island, is one of the most consequential, and most misunderstood, chapters in the entire history of American organized crime. To understand the significance of this meeting, you first have to understand who Al Capone was before he became Al Capone, before the fedora, before the scars, before the name became synonymous with an entire era of American criminal history. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in 1899 in the Navy Yard section of Brooklyn, the fourth child of Gabrielle and Teresa Capone, immigrants from a town near Naples. Unlike the popular image of the gangster born into crime and poverty from his earliest breath, the Capone family was, by the standards of their neighborhood, relatively respectable. Gabrielle Capone worked as a barber, a trade that required literacy and a degree of skill, and the family valued education in a way that many of their neighbors, struggling simply to put food on the table, could not afford to prioritize. Young Al showed early promise. He was, by most accounts, a capable student, and there are records suggesting he performed well enough in his early school years to draw positive attention from his teachers. But something shifted as he entered adolescence. Whether it was the raw magnetism of the streets around him, the restless energy of a boy who found classroom discipline suffocating, or simply the ordinary rebelliousness of a teenager testing the boundaries of authority, Capone's academic path took a sharp and fateful turn at around age 14, when he struck a female teacher who had disciplined him in class. The incident resulted in his expulsion, and with that expulsion, the last conventional path available to young Al Capone effectively closed. What replaced it was the street. Capone drifted, as so many boys in his position did, into the orbit of local gangs, first the South Brooklyn Rippers, and later the more notorious 5 Points Gang, one of the most powerful and violent street gangs operating in New York City during this era, an organization that, remarkably, would also produce or influence several other future giants of American organized crime. It was through these gang connections, and through the tightly interwoven social fabric of Italian immigrant Brooklyn, that young Capone eventually came to the attention of Frankie Yale. By this point, Yale was already an established, respected, and feared figure in the neighborhood, the president of the Union Siciliana's Brooklyn chapter, the owner of the Harvard Inn, a man whose name commanded instant recognition among the young toughs of South Brooklyn who dreamed of the kind of respect and wealth he had accumulated. For a restless, ambitious teenager like Capone, expelled from school, with limited legitimate prospects and a hunger for something more than the grinding poverty that surrounded him, working for a man like Frankie Yale wasn't simply a job opportunity. It was, in the truest sense, an apprenticeship into a world that offered everything the legitimate economy denied him: money, respect, power, and a clear, visible path upward for a young man willing to prove his loyalty and his nerve. Yale hired Capone to work at the Harvard Inn, initially in relatively menial roles, as a bartender, and, crucially, as a bouncer, a position that required physical courage, a willingness to use violence when necessary, and the kind of street-smart judgment about when to de-escalate a situation and when to let it explode. It was, in many ways, the perfect training ground. The Harvard Inn on any given night was filled with sailors, dockworkers, and small-time criminals, many of them drunk, many of them looking for trouble, and the young men who worked the door needed to be able to handle themselves in situations that could turn violent with almost no warning. It was in this environment, working the door of the Harvard Inn, that the incident occurred which would leave Al Capone permanently marked, both physically and in the public imagination, for the rest of his life. The most widely accepted account, though there have been minor variations told over the decades, centers on an encounter with a woman named Lena Galluccio, who came to the club with her brother, Frank Galluccio. Accounts differ somewhat on the exact provocation. Some versions suggest Capone made a crude, disrespectful comment about Lena Galluccio's appearance as she passed by, not realizing or not caring that her brother was standing close enough to hear. Whatever the precise words were, they were enough to ignite a violent confrontation. Frank Galluccio, deeply offended by the insult to his sister's honor, a matter of enormous weight in the tightly bound honor culture of Italian immigrant Brooklyn, responded not with words, but with a knife. The attack was fast and brutal. Galluccio slashed Capone 3 times across the left side of his face, wound severe enough to require extensive stitching and leaving Capone with 3 thick, permanent scars running down his cheek, scars that would follow him for the rest of his life, that would eventually earn him the nickname the entire world would come to know him by, Scarface, a name Capone himself reportedly despised and forbade people from using in his presence, preferring instead to tell curious strangers that his scars were the result of war wounds sustained during his service in World War I, a war he had, in fact, never fought in. What happened next reveals something essential about Frankie Yale's character, and about the particular kind of leadership that made him such an effective boss. In many criminal organizations, especially the loosely structured, volatile street gangs of that era, an incident like this, a subordinate humiliated and nearly killed in a dispute that reflected poorly on the establishment where it occurred, might have resulted in the subordinate being cast aside, discarded as damaged goods, a liability rather than an asset. Yale did the opposite. Rather than distancing himself from the injured young bouncer, he moved to protect him, and, in doing so, cemented a bond of loyalty that would define the next several years of both men's lives. Yale intervened to prevent the conflict from spiraling into a full-blown gang war between his organization and the Galluccio family's associates, brokering something resembling peace, while also ensuring that Capone understood, through both actions and words, that this humiliating injury would not define or diminish his standing within Yale's organization. This response taught the young Capone an invaluable lesson about leadership, one he would carry with him for the rest of his career, that a boss who protects his men, who stands by them even after a costly and embarrassing failure, earns a loyalty that no amount of money alone can purchase. It was a lesson Capone would apply ruthlessly and effectively in his own rise to power in Chicago, building an organization renowned even among his enemies for the fierce loyalty of the men who served him. From this point forward, the relationship between Frankie Yale and Al Capone deepened considerably. Yale began taking a more direct, personal interest in the young man's development, and Capone, for his part, threw himself into proving his value with the kind of relentless energy that would come to define his entire career. He was smart, genuinely, sharply intelligent, capable of understanding complex financial arrangements and organizational structures with an ease that surprised those who underestimated him based on his rough manner and violent reputation. He was also, crucially, willing to do whatever was asked of him, without hesitation, without complaint, and without the kind of squeamishness that made some men unsuitable for the darker aspects of the business. Yale began teaching Capone the fundamentals of the trade, not simply the mechanics of violence, which Capone had already demonstrated a natural aptitude for, but the far more valuable, far more subtle skills that separated a street thug from a true criminal executive. He taught him how to manage the delicate relationships with corrupt police officers and politicians that made large-scale criminal enterprise possible. He taught him how to read a room, how to project calm authority even in moments of extreme tension, how to negotiate disputes between rival factions in ways that preserved profit and avoided unnecessary bloodshed. He taught him the value of charitable generosity as a tool for building genuine goodwill within the community, a lesson Capone would later apply spectacularly in Chicago, where his soup kitchens during the early years of the Great Depression made him, to the astonishment of federal investigators, a genuinely beloved figure among Chicago's working poor, even as he ran one of the most violent criminal empires in American history. Perhaps most importantly, Yale taught Capone something about the strategic use of violence, the same lesson he himself had learned and refined over years of building his own empire. Violence, deployed carelessly or emotionally, was a liability. It drew unwanted attention, invited retaliation, and created enemies faster than it eliminated them. Violence deployed strategically, with careful planning and clear purpose, was simply another tool of business, no different in principle from a well-negotiated contract or a well-timed bribe. Capone absorbed this lesson deeply, and it would echo throughout his entire criminal career, from the calculated brutality of his rise in Chicago to the meticulous planning behind operations that would later shock the nation with their scale and audacity. It's worth pausing here to reflect on the peculiar intimacy of the mentor-protégé relationship in the criminal underworld, because it differs in important ways from mentorship in legitimate professions. In a legitimate business, a mentor might risk losing a promotion or a client to an ambitious protégé. In the underworld that Frankie Yale and Al Capone inhabited, the stakes of mentorship were existential. Teaching a young man everything you know, your methods, your connections, your understanding of how violence and business intertwine, meant, quite literally, teaching him how to survive, and potentially how to eventually challenge or replace you. Yet Yale, in these early years, seemed to give little thought to this risk. Capone was young, useful, fiercely loyal, and clearly talented, and in the moment, the benefits of investing in his development far outweighed any hypothetical future threat he might someday pose. This is, in many ways, the great tragic irony that will echo through the rest of this series. The very qualities that made Al Capone such a valuable asset to Frankie Yale in these formative years, his intelligence, his ruthlessness, his capacity for calculated violence, his understanding of organizational structure, his charm and his menace existing side by side in perfect balance, were the exact same qualities that would eventually make him powerful enough, and eventually threatened enough, to order his mentor's execution. But that betrayal was still years away. In these early years, the relationship between Yale and Capone was, by all accounts, genuinely warm, genuinely built on mutual respect and something resembling real affection. Yale saw in Capone a younger version of himself, hungry, capable, hardened by circumstance but sharp enough to rise above it. Capone, for his part, saw in Yale everything he aspired to become, a man who commanded respect not through chaos, but through calm, calculated control, a man who had built genuine wealth and power out of nothing more than intelligence, nerve, and an absolute willingness to do what needed to be done. As Prohibition arrived in January of 1920, transforming the entire American criminal landscape almost overnight, this mentor-protégé relationship would face its first true test, not a test of loyalty, but a test of opportunity. The illegal liquor trade that Prohibition created was, quite simply, the largest criminal enterprise in American history up to that point, generating wealth on a scale that dwarfed anything the Black Hand extortion rackets or gambling operations of the previous decade could have produced. Frankie Yale, with his established organization, his political connections, and his control over key waterfront and transportation routes in Brooklyn, was perfectly positioned to become one of the primary architects of New York's bootlegging empire. And when opportunity called Al Capone away from Brooklyn, when a request came from Chicago, from a distant relative and associate named Johnny Torrio, asking Yale to send a capable young man west to help manage a rapidly growing criminal operation in the Midwest, it was Frankie Yale who made the recommendation. It was Frankie Yale who essentially handed Al Capone the opportunity that would transform him from a promising Brooklyn bouncer into the most powerful and infamous gangster in American history. Yale could not have known, in that moment, the full weight of what he was setting in motion. He was doing what any good mentor does, recognizing the ceiling of opportunity in his own organization, and helping a talented protégé find a larger stage on which to grow. It was, in its own way, an act of genuine generosity, a testament to the real bond between the two men. But it was also, in retrospect, the first domino in a chain of events that would eventually lead to Frankie Yale's own violent death, orchestrated not by a rival, not by a stranger, but by the very student he had trained, protected, and ultimately launched toward a level of power and wealth that would come to eclipse his own. In our next part, we'll follow Capone to Chicago, and trace the astonishing speed of his rise under Johnny Torrio's guidance, while back in Brooklyn, Frankie Yale builds the greatest criminal empire of his own career, becoming one of the wealthiest and most powerful bootlegging kings on the entire eastern seaboard. Two empires, built by the same hands, growing simultaneously in different cities, until the day their interests would collide, and an old debt of loyalty would curdle into something far darker. If this story has pulled you in the way it pulled me in while researching it, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to tell these forgotten, complicated, deeply human stories from the shadows of history, the ones that don't get the Hollywood treatment, the ones buried in old newspaper archives and court records. There's a lot more of this world left to explore, and I'd love to have you along for the rest of the journey. By the time the 18th Amendment took full legal effect on January 17, 1920, Frankie Yale had already spent nearly a decade building the exact kind of organization that Prohibition would reward beyond anyone's wildest imagination. What followed over the next several years was not simply criminal opportunism, it was the systematic construction of one of the most profitable illegal enterprises in American history, and Frankie Yale sat near its very center, controlling one of the most strategically vital pieces of real estate in the entire bootlegging economy, the waterfront of Brooklyn, New York. To understand why this mattered so enormously, you have to understand the basic mechanics of how illegal alcohol actually moved through the United States during the 1920s. Prohibition did not eliminate the demand for alcohol. If anything, it seemed to increase the cultural appetite for it, transforming drinking from an ordinary social activity into a thrilling act of rebellion, glamorized in speakeasies, jazz clubs, and the popular imagination of an entire generation eager to defy what many considered an overreaching moral crusade by the federal government. But eliminating legal domestic production meant that the enormous demand had to be satisfied through alternative channels, smuggling finished liquor from Canada, the Caribbean, and Europe, illegally diverting industrial alcohol and redistilling it for consumption, often with dangerous or even lethal results, and, increasingly, large-scale illegal domestic distilling and brewing operations hidden in warehouses, farmhouses, and industrial buildings across the country. New York City, and Brooklyn in particular, occupied an extraordinarily privileged position in this new criminal economy. Its harbor was one of the busiest in the world, its waterfront lined with piers, warehouses, and shipping operations that had, for generations, moved legitimate cargo in and out of the city. That same infrastructure, and crucially, the same networks of dockworkers, union officials, harbor police, and customs officers, could be repurposed with relative ease to move an entirely different kind of cargo, cases of Canadian whiskey, Caribbean rum, and Scotch smuggled across the Atlantic, all destined for the thirsty speakeasies of Manhattan and beyond. Frankie Yale had spent years cultivating exactly the kind of relationships that made controlling this operation possible. His years as president of the Brooklyn chapter of the Unione Siciliana had given him deep, trusted connections throughout the Italian-American dockworker community. His years of careful, strategic bribery had given him relationships with police captains, customs officials, and local politicians who understood that a certain amount of looking the other way was simply the cost of doing business in a city where illegal liquor was, by the mid-1920s, flowing more freely than the East River itself. And his reputation for calm, calculated control, built over more than a decade of extortion, gambling, and labor racketeering, meant that when Frankie Yale organized a bootlegging network, other criminal factions in the city understood, without needing to be told twice, that this was not territory worth challenging carelessly. The mechanics of Yale's bootlegging empire were, in their own dark way, a masterpiece of organizational efficiency. Ships carrying legal cargoes of liquor would anchor just outside the 3-mile limit of American territorial waters, in what became known as Rum Row, a loose flotilla of vessels stretching along the Atlantic coast, technically beyond the reach of American law enforcement. From there, smaller, faster boats, often manned by local fishermen and dockworkers supplementing their meager legitimate incomes, would ferry the liquor to shore under cover of darkness, landing it at predetermined points along the Brooklyn and Long Island coastline where Yale's organization maintained control and, crucially, had already ensured that local law enforcement would be conveniently absent or deliberately unobservant. From these landing points, the liquor moved inland through a network of trucks, warehouses, and distribution points that Yale's organization controlled with the same disciplined efficiency he had brought to every previous criminal enterprise. Corrupt police officers, paid handsomely for their cooperation, provided advance warning of any planned raids or patrols. Politicians, dependent on the votes and financial support that Yale's organization could deliver, ensured that prosecutions, on the rare occasions they occurred at all, resulted in minimal consequences. And throughout the entire operation, Yale maintained the same careful, patient approach to violence that had defined his approach since his earliest days in the Black Hand extortion rackets. Force was used when necessary, decisively and without hesitation, but never recklessly, never in a way that would draw more attention than the profits justified. The financial scale of this operation is difficult to overstate. Historians estimate that organized bootlegging operations of this scale generated profits that, in modern terms, would be measured in the tens of millions of dollars annually, and Frankie Yale, as one of the primary architects of Brooklyn's bootlegging infrastructure, took a substantial cut of virtually every case of liquor that moved through his territory. He became, within just a few short years of Prohibition's implementation, one of the wealthiest criminal figures in New York City, his lifestyle transforming to match his fortune. He moved his family into an increasingly comfortable home, dressed in expensive, carefully tailored suits, and cultivated the public image of a successful, respectable businessman, even as his private empire continued to operate through intimidation, bribery, and, when necessary, murder. It's worth pausing here to talk about the particular way Frankie Yale chose to present himself to the wider world during this period, because it reveals something important about how the most successful organized crime figures of this era operated. Unlike the flamboyant, headline-grabbing style that would later make Al Capone a household name, complete with his ostentatious jewelry, his flashy cars, and his open courting of newspaper reporters, Frankie Yale cultivated a far more understated public presence. He owned legitimate businesses that provided both genuine income and convenient cover for his illegal operations, including funeral parlors, a business choice that carried its own darkly ironic resonance given how many of his rivals and enemies would eventually require his industry's services. He was active in local charitable and civic organizations, attended church, and was known throughout his neighborhood as a generous, community-minded figure who could be relied upon to help struggling families, fund local events, and mediate neighborhood disputes with even-handed wisdom. This careful cultivation of respectability was not mere vanity. It served a genuine strategic purpose. A criminal figure who maintained strong, positive relationships within his community was far more insulated from the risks that constantly threatened less careful operators, the risk of being informed upon by resentful victims or neighbors, the risk of losing crucial political support when law enforcement pressure increased, the risk of public outrage that could force even corrupt politicians to distance themselves for the sake of their own survival. Frankie Yale understood, with the same clarity he had applied to every other aspect of his criminal career, that genuine community goodwill was itself a form of protection, every bit as valuable as the corrupt police captains and compliant politicians he had spent years cultivating. As his bootlegging operation grew, so did Yale's broader criminal portfolio. He expanded aggressively into what would become one of the defining criminal enterprises of the Prohibition era, labor racketeering within the trucking and dock unions that moved so much of the illegal liquor flowing through New York. Control over these unions gave Yale enormous leverage, allowing him to extract payments from legitimate businesses desperate to avoid labor disputes, while simultaneously ensuring that his own bootlegging operations enjoyed reliable, cooperative labor free from the disruptions that might otherwise threaten his profits. He also expanded his gambling operations significantly during this period, capitalizing on the enormous cash flow generated by bootlegging to finance an increasingly sophisticated network of illegal casinos, card games, and numbers rackets throughout Brooklyn and beyond. Meanwhile, roughly 700 miles to the west, in the city of Chicago, the young man Frankie Yale had mentored and eventually sent off with his blessing was undergoing his own extraordinary transformation. Al Capone had arrived in Chicago in the early 1920s to work under Johnny Torrio, an experienced and highly capable crime boss who had, like Yale, recognized the enormous opportunity that Prohibition represented and had begun systematically building an organization to exploit it. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone rose with startling speed through the ranks of Chicago's underworld, and when an assassination attempt in 1925 left Torrio badly wounded and thoroughly disillusioned with the constant violence of the criminal life, Torrio made the decision to retire, handing control of his entire Chicago operation to his young, ambitious protege. Al Capone, still in his mid-20s, suddenly found himself at the head of one of the largest and most profitable criminal organizations in the entire United States. And it's worth noting, in the context of this story, that the foundational skills Capone deployed to seize and consolidate that power, the careful balance of calculated violence and strategic generosity, the sophisticated understanding of how to corrupt and control local politics and law enforcement, the instinct for organizational structure that transformed a loose collection of criminal enterprises into something resembling a genuine corporate hierarchy, all of it traced directly back to the lessons he had absorbed as a young bouncer at the Harvard Inn, watching and learning from Frankie Yale. The relationship between the two men did not end when Capone left Brooklyn for Chicago. If anything, Prohibition created new, mutually beneficial reasons for their continued collaboration. Yale's Brooklyn operation controlled crucial East Coast smuggling routes and distribution networks, while Capone's Chicago operation controlled one of the largest markets for illegal liquor in the entire country. Business arrangements between the two organizations, involving the movement of liquor, the sharing of intelligence about law enforcement activity, and occasional cooperation on matters requiring discretion and trust, continued to flow between Brooklyn and Chicago throughout the mid-1920s, maintaining the bond between mentor and former protege even as both men's individual empires grew to extraordinary scale. But empires built on illegal enterprise, however sophisticated their organization, however carefully cultivated their political protection, inevitably generate friction, and by the mid-1920s, cracks were beginning to show in the relationship between Frankie Yale and Al Capone, cracks that would, within just a few short years, widen into a chasm that neither man's considerable skill at managing relationships and controlling violence would be able to bridge. The specific source of this friction involved one of the most sensitive and lucrative aspects of the entire bootlegging trade, the movement of large shipments of Canadian whiskey through hijacking-prone smuggling routes that connected New York's harbor to the broader distribution network stretching across the eastern and midwestern United States. Capone's Chicago organization had come to rely heavily on liquor supplied through arrangements brokered, at least in part, through Yale's Brooklyn connections. When shipments began disappearing, hijacked by unknown parties before they could reach their intended destination, Capone's organization suffered significant financial losses that inevitably raised uncomfortable questions about exactly who might be responsible for the thefts, and whether the answer might be uncomfortably close to home. We will explore the full, tangled details of this growing conflict in our next part, because it represents the true beginning of the end for Frankie Yale, the slow, poisonous erosion of trust between mentor and student that would eventually culminate in one of the most historically significant assassinations of the entire Prohibition era. But it's worth pausing here, at the height of Frankie Yale's power and wealth, to appreciate the full scope of what he had built. From a poor immigrant boy in a Calabrian mountain village, to a teenage extortionist in the tenements of South Brooklyn, to the president of a powerful fraternal organization providing cover for his criminal enterprises, to one of the wealthiest and most influential bootlegging kings on the entire eastern seaboard, Frankie Yale had constructed an empire through nothing more than intelligence, patience, calculated violence, and an extraordinary gift for understanding exactly what other people wanted and exactly how far he could push them. By 1927, Frankie Yale stood, by almost any measure, at the absolute peak of his criminal career. He controlled a vast, profitable network of bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering operations. He commanded fierce loyalty from an organization of dozens of men. He maintained the kind of political and law enforcement protection that made him virtually untouchable within his own territory. And he had, in Al Capone, a former protege who had grown into one of the most powerful criminal figures in the entire country, a relationship that should have represented one of the great strategic assets of Yale's entire career. But empires, as history teaches us again and again, rarely fall from external assault alone. They rot from within, poisoned by suspicion, by greed, by the impossible tension between old loyalties and new ambitions. And in the story of Frankie Yale, that rot was already beginning to spread, hidden beneath the surface of a relationship that both men, for the moment, still described as friendship. Trust, in the world Frankie Yale had spent his entire life building, was never an absolute. It was a currency, carefully weighed, constantly renegotiated, extended only as far as circumstances demanded and withdrawn the moment it stopped serving a purpose. Yale understood this instinctively, had understood it since his earliest days running black-hand extortion rackets through the tenements of South Brooklyn. What makes the final chapters of his relationship with Al Capone so genuinely tragic, in the classical sense of that word, is that the very mentor who taught his protégé this cold calculus of loyalty and self-interest would eventually become its victim, undone by exactly the kind of ruthless, unsentimental logic he himself had instilled. By 1927, the bootlegging economy that had made both men extraordinarily wealthy had also grown extraordinarily complex, a sprawling, multi-state web of smuggling routes, distribution networks, and shifting alliances that stretched from the docks of Brooklyn to the speakeasies of Chicago and beyond. Managing an operation of this scale required not just organizational discipline, but constant vigilance, because the same qualities that made Prohibition-era bootlegging so profitable, the enormous cash flows, the constant movement of valuable, easily concealed cargo, the inherent secrecy required by an illegal enterprise, also made it extraordinarily vulnerable to theft, both from outside rivals and, more dangerously, from within an organization's own ranks. It was against this backdrop that Al Capone's Chicago organization began experiencing a troubling pattern of losses. Large shipments of Canadian whiskey, smuggled across Lake Michigan and through various overland routes connecting to the broader eastern smuggling networks that Frankie Yale's Brooklyn operation helped coordinate, began disappearing before reaching their intended Chicago destinations. These were not small, incidental losses that could be written off as the ordinary cost of doing business in a criminal enterprise. They were significant, repeated thefts, involving shipments worth substantial sums of money, and they occurred with a consistency that suggested something far more troubling than simple bad luck or opportunistic freelance hijackers operating without inside knowledge. For Al Capone, now firmly established as one of the most powerful crime bosses in the entire country, commanding an organization that generated tens of millions of dollars annually and employing hundreds of men across a sprawling criminal empire, these losses represented more than just a financial inconvenience. They represented a direct challenge to his authority, a vulnerability that, if left unaddressed, threatened to undermine the very foundation of respect and fear upon which his entire organization depended. In the criminal world Capone inhabited, a boss who could be repeatedly robbed without consequence was a boss whose power was, by definition, in question. Something had to be done, and someone had to be identified and punished, regardless of who that someone turned out to be. The investigation into these hijackings, conducted through the informal but highly effective intelligence networks that organized crime figures relied upon in lieu of formal law enforcement, eventually pointed toward an uncomfortable and deeply troubling conclusion. The thefts appeared to be originating from within Frankie Yale's own Brooklyn organization, potentially with Yale's direct knowledge, participation, or at the very least, willful blindness. Whether this suspicion was entirely accurate, partially accurate, or the product of misinformation deliberately planted by rivals seeking to sow discord between two of the most powerful criminal figures in the country, remains, even to historians who have studied this period extensively, a matter of some genuine uncertainty. What is not in question is that Al Capone came to believe, with growing conviction, that his former mentor was betraying him, skimming from shipments that Capone's organization had paid for in full, profiting twice from the same liquor by both facilitating its transport and then arranging for its theft before it could reach its final destination. To understand why Frankie Yale might have made such a catastrophic decision, if indeed he did, requires understanding the particular financial and psychological pressures that were beginning to weigh on him during this period. Yale's Brooklyn operation, however profitable, existed within an increasingly crowded and violent criminal landscape. New York's underworld during the late 1920s was fracturing into competing factions, old guard Sicilian and Italian crime bosses finding themselves increasingly challenged by a younger, more aggressive generation of criminals less bound by traditional codes of conduct and more willing to resort to open warfare to expand their territory and their profits. Maintaining Yale's position at the top of this increasingly volatile hierarchy required constant, expensive investment, in bribes, in enforcement, in the elaborate infrastructure of corruption and intimidation that had always underpinned his power. There is also a simpler, more human explanation worth considering, one that speaks to something universal about the psychology of men who build empires through their own talent and effort, the temptation of unchecked opportunity. Frankie Yale had spent his entire adult life operating according to a code that valued profit above sentiment, that treated relationships, even genuine ones, as assets to be leveraged when circumstances demanded it. If an opportunity presented itself to profit from shipments moving through his own territory, shipments that Capone's organization depended upon but that Yale's organization physically controlled at a crucial vulnerable point in their journey, the same cold calculation that had built his entire criminal career may well have concluded that the profit was simply too significant to leave on the table, regardless of the relationship at stake. Whether Yale was, in fact, guilty of orchestrating these hijackings remains genuinely disputed among historians who have examined the surviving evidence, much of which is fragmentary, filtered through decades of second-hand accounts, law enforcement speculation, and the inherent unreliability of information about a criminal underworld that left few reliable written records. What matters, for the purposes of understanding how this story ultimately unfolded, is not necessarily what actually happened, but what Al Capone came to believe had happened, and the actions that belief set into motion. As suspicion mounted throughout 1927 and into 1928, the relationship between the two men, which had remained warm and mutually beneficial for nearly a decade, began to curdle into something far colder and more dangerous. Communications between the two organizations, once characterized by the easy familiarity of old friends and business partners who had built their respective empires from shared foundations, grew increasingly formal, increasingly guarded. Intermediaries who traveled between Brooklyn and Chicago carrying messages and negotiating the details of ongoing business arrangements began reporting a palpable tension in these exchanges, a sense that both organizations were beginning to prepare, quietly and carefully, for the possibility that their long partnership might be approaching a violent end. It's worth pausing here to consider the particular tragedy embedded in this unfolding conflict, because it illuminates something essential about the nature of power in the criminal underworld that Frankie Yale had spent his entire life mastering. Yale had built his empire on a foundation of calculated, strategic relationships, understanding that lasting power required not just the capacity for violence, but the wisdom to deploy it sparingly, to maintain the kind of long-term alliances that could weather individual disputes and disagreements. Al Capone, his most successful student, had absorbed this lesson thoroughly, and had built his own Chicago empire according to many of the same principles. But Capone had also learned, from watching his mentor operate for years, a harder, more brutal corollary to this same philosophy, that when trust was genuinely broken, when a relationship no longer served its intended purpose, sentiment could not be allowed to interfere with necessary action. Yale had taught Capone, both explicitly and through years of quiet example, that survival in their world sometimes required eliminating even those closest to you, if their continued existence posed a genuine threat to your own power and safety. This lesson, absorbed so thoroughly by the student, would soon be turned against the teacher himself. Compounding the growing distrust between Yale and Capone was a second, equally consequential source of tension that had been building throughout the mid-1920s, a bitter and increasingly violent power struggle within the leadership of the Unione Siciliana itself, the same fraternal organization whose presidency had once given Frankie Yale his crucial early legitimacy in the Brooklyn underworld. The Unione Siciliana's national leadership had become, by the late 1920s, one of the most contested and dangerous positions in all of organized crime, precisely because it conferred such significant legitimacy and influence over Italian-American criminal networks across multiple cities. A rapid succession of Unione Siciliana presidents in Chicago had been assassinated in the years leading up to 1928, each new leader lasting only months before falling victim to the same kind of violence that had claimed his predecessor, as rival factions within Chicago's Italian-American underworld fought for control over this prestigious and lucrative position. Frankie Yale, still commanding significant influence within the broader national structure of the Unione Siciliana, had reportedly become involved in these Chicago power struggles, and his interests in this matter did not necessarily align neatly with Al Capone's own preferences for who should hold this influential position. Some historical accounts suggest that Yale actively supported candidates for the Chicago Union Siciliana presidency who were opposed to Capone's interests, potentially including rivals who represented a genuine threat to Capone's authority within Chicago's Italian-American criminal community. If accurate, this would represent yet another layer of betrayal in Capone's eyes, evidence that his former mentor was not merely skimming profits from hijacked liquor shipments, but actively working to undermine his position and empower his enemies within his own city. By the spring of 1928, the accumulated weight of these grievances, the suspected liquor hijackings, the political maneuvering within the Union Siciliana, the general erosion of trust that comes from years of operating in an environment where paranoia is not merely common but genuinely rational, had brought the relationship between Frankie Yale and Al Capone to a breaking point. What had once been one of the most significant mentor-protégé relationships in the history of American organized crime, a bond that had helped build two of the largest criminal empires the country had ever seen, was now approaching its violent conclusion. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine that Al Capone approached the decision to move against his former mentor with anything resembling impulsiveness or emotional rashness. Everything we know about how Capone operated, both from his own organization's internal culture and from the broader patterns of behavior he had absorbed from Yale himself, suggests that any decision to eliminate a figure as significant and well-connected as Frankie Yale would have been approached with the same careful, methodical planning that characterized every major operation of Capone's Chicago empire. Evidence would need to be gathered, or at least assembled to Capone's own satisfaction. Alliances would need to be secured, ensuring that other significant figures within the broader criminal underworld would not view the elimination of Frankie Yale as an act requiring retaliation. And crucially, the method of execution itself would need to be planned with extraordinary care, because killing a man as well protected, as politically connected, and as personally cautious as Frankie Yale was not a task that could be approached carelessly. Yale, for his part, was not entirely unaware that his relationship with his former protégé had deteriorated significantly. Men in his position, having built entire careers on the ability to read subtle shifts in loyalty and power, rarely remain completely oblivious to growing danger, even from sources they might have once considered unshakable allies. There is evidence to suggest that Yale had begun taking additional security precautions during this period, aware that the accumulated tensions of the hijacking suspicions and the Union Siciliana disputes had created genuine risk. But understanding that danger exists in the abstract, and successfully protecting yourself against a specific, carefully planned attack, are two very different things, and Frankie Yale, for all his decades of hard-won street wisdom, was about to discover that even the most careful, most experienced criminal figure could be caught fatally unprepared when the blow finally came. What makes the assassination that was now being planned so historically significant is not merely the personal tragedy of a mentor betrayed by his own student, though that dimension of the story carries genuine emotional weight even a century later. It is the method by which that assassination would ultimately be carried out, a method that had never before been used on American soil, and that would go on to define an entire era of gangland violence in the American popular imagination. Somewhere in Chicago, in the spring and early summer of 1928, a plan was taking shape that would introduce a new and terrifying weapon into the arsenal of organized crime, a weapon that would transform a quiet Brooklyn street into the site of one of the most historically consequential murders in the entire history of American organized crime. Sunday, July 1, 1928, began like countless other summer afternoons in Frankie Yale's life. He had spent the morning at his home in Brooklyn, a comfortable, well-appointed house that reflected nearly 2 decades of accumulated wealth, first through the brutal apprenticeship of Black Hand extortion, then through the presidency of the Union Siciliana, and finally through the extraordinary riches of Prohibition-era bootlegging. He was 35 years old. He had a wife, Maria, and a young daughter who adored him, and by every outward measure, he remained one of the most powerful and untouchable criminal figures in New York City. As we traced in the previous part, the weeks leading up to that Sunday had been anything but ordinary. The suspected liquor hijackings, the political maneuvering within the Union Siciliana, the slow, poisonous erosion of trust between Yale and his former protégé, all of it had been building towards something neither man could fully walk back. Associates would later recall a subtle wariness in Yale's demeanor during those final weeks, a tendency to vary his routines, to keep more armed men close. But understanding that danger exists in the abstract, and successfully defending against a specific, meticulously planned attack, are entirely different things. Frankie Yale, for all his hard-earned street wisdom, was about to discover the fatal gap between the two. What Yale could not have fully anticipated was the method by which his former student had decided to eliminate him. Capone's Chicago organization had, by 1928, access to weaponry and tactical sophistication that far exceeded almost anything the New York underworld had yet encountered. Among the tools increasingly favored by Capone's most trusted enforcers was the Thompson submachine gun, a weapon capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, devastating in close combat, and, crucially, almost entirely unfamiliar to East Coast criminal organizations still largely accustomed to a violence defined by pistols, knives, and the occasional stationary shotgun ambush. Combining this weapon with a mobile assault, gunmen firing from within a moving vehicle rather than a fixed position, created something genuinely new in the history of American organized crime. A tactic that would soon become horrifyingly familiar across the country, but that, on that first Sunday in July of 1928, had never before been deployed on the streets of New York. The identities of the men who carried out the assassination have never been conclusively established with the certainty a court of law would require, a testament to how carefully the operation was planned. What investigators and historians have pieced together over the decades, through witness accounts, forensic evidence, and the broader pattern of relationships and motives surrounding the killing, points overwhelmingly toward gunmen dispatched from Chicago, operating on behalf of Al Capone, though Capone himself, ever careful to maintain distance and plausible deniability, was reportedly in Chicago at the time and was never formally charged in connection with the murder. That Sunday afternoon, Frankie Yale left his home to run what should have been an unremarkable errand. Accounts vary slightly on the precise sequence of events, but the essential facts remain consistent across most historical records. Yale received a phone call, the content of which has never been definitively established, though some accounts suggest it may have been a pretext designed to draw him out of the relative safety of his home and into a location that made him vulnerable. He got into his car, a brand new Lincoln that reflected his considerable wealth, and began driving through the streets of Brooklyn, the same borough that had watched him rise from a poor immigrant teenager running black hand rackets to one of the wealthiest bootlegging kings on the entire eastern seaboard. As Yale's car moved along 44th Street in the Borough Park section of Brooklyn, another vehicle began following him. Witnesses would later describe a dark sedan carrying several men, pulling alongside or behind Yale's car. What happened next would become one of the most historically significant moments in the entire chronicle of American organized crime, not merely because of who was killed, but because of how. The gunman opened fire with Thompson submachine guns, spraying Yale's Lincoln with a hail of bullets fired from a moving car at another moving car, a tactic of such unprecedented speed and violence that witnesses on the street, accustomed to the occasional gangland shooting but never anything approaching this scale of firepower, described a scene of pure chaos, the deafening, unfamiliar rattle of automatic weapons fired tearing through a quiet residential Brooklyn street on a Sunday afternoon. Yale's car, hit repeatedly, careened out of control and crashed into the steps of a nearby house. When police and horrified neighbors reached the vehicle, they found Frankie Yale dead behind the wheel, his body riddled with bullets, killed almost instantly by the sheer volume of gunfire directed at him. The murder sent shockwaves through the New York underworld and, within days, through the broader American public. This was not simply another gangland killing, of which there had been many during the violent years of Prohibition. This was something new, and something that immediately captured the horrified fascination of newspapers across the country, the first documented drive-by shooting using a Thompson submachine gun in New York City history, a tactic imported directly from the increasingly brutal gang wars raging in Chicago. Newspapers ran extensive coverage describing, in vivid detail, the scene on 44th Street, the shattered glass, the bullet-riddled Lincoln, the body of one of Brooklyn's most powerful and, in his own carefully cultivated way, respected criminal figures, left dead in his own beloved borough by an attack of a scale and sophistication most Americans had previously associated only with Chicago. The investigation, conducted by New York City police in the immediate aftermath, moved quickly toward the obvious, and in hindsight almost inevitable, conclusion: this had been an assassination ordered from Chicago, carried out by gunmen closely affiliated with Al Capone's organization, in retaliation for the accumulated grievances of hijacked liquor and political interference in the Unione Siciliana that had poisoned the once close relationship between mentor and protege. Ballistics analysis on a recovered Thompson submachine gun, which investigators managed to trace through careful forensic work, would eventually connect the weapon to firearms associated with Capone's Chicago operation, providing perhaps the closest thing to concrete physical evidence linking the killing to its presumed architect. But despite this, and despite the near-universal understanding within both law enforcement circles and the criminal underworld itself regarding who was truly responsible, no one was ever successfully prosecuted for the murder of Frankie Yale. Capone, characteristically insulated by layers of intermediaries, careful alibis, and the simple, brutal fact that witnesses to organized crime violence in this era rarely lived long enough or felt safe enough to testify, was never charged. The funeral of Frankie Yale, held in the days following his murder, was, in its own dark way, a testament to the extraordinary scale of the empire he had built during his relatively short life. Thousands of mourners reportedly lined the streets of Brooklyn to watch the funeral procession, an outpouring that reflected both genuine grief among those who had known Yale as a generous, community-minded figure in his neighborhood, and the simple, undeniable spectacle of watching one of the most powerful men in the borough's history laid to rest. The funeral itself was staged with the kind of ostentatious grandeur that had become almost a signature of major organized crime figures during this era, an elaborate procession of flower cars carrying enormous floral tributes, a hearse trailed by dozens of vehicles carrying mourners, associates, and, undoubtedly, more than a few curious onlookers and undercover investigators, all moving slowly through the streets of the same Brooklyn neighborhoods where Frankie Yale had built his entire life. And his entire criminal empire. There is a particular, almost unbearable irony embedded in the fact that Frankie Yale, who had built one of his own legitimate business fronts around a chain of funeral parlors, was ultimately given a funeral that reflected the same theatrical grandeur he had spent years providing for others, a final, dark symmetry to a life defined by the careful management of appearances, the constant balance between respectable public image and brutal private reality. The murder of Frankie Yale carries a significance in the history of American organized crime that extends well beyond the personal tragedy of a mentor betrayed and killed by his own protege. It marked, in a very real and historically documented sense, the introduction of a new era of gangland violence in the United States, one defined by increasingly sophisticated weaponry, increasingly brazen tactics, and an escalating scale of public violence that would culminate, just 7 months later, in an event that would forever cement the Thompson submachine gun's place in the American popular imagination as the definitive symbol of Prohibition-era gangland warfare, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of February 1929, in which 7 members of a rival Chicago gang were gunned down by men associated with Capone's organization, using the same brutal, efficient tactics first deployed against Frankie Yale on that quiet Brooklyn street. It is difficult, examining the full arc of this story, to avoid drawing a direct thematic line between the murder of Frankie Yale and the massacre that followed it 7 months later, both events connected not merely by the weapon used or the organization responsible, but by a deeper truth about the trajectory of Al Capone's entire criminal career. The lessons Capone had absorbed from Frankie Yale, patience, calculated violence, the strategic elimination of threats regardless of personal loyalty or historical debt, had been so thoroughly internalized that Capone was not merely capable of applying them against his own mentor when circumstances demanded it, but was prepared to escalate the very methods of violence itself to new and terrifying heights. Heights that would define his own legend, and, in time, contribute to his own downfall. What became of the empire Frankie Yale left behind? In the immediate aftermath of his murder, the vast bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering operations he had spent nearly 2 decades building did not simply vanish overnight. Various lieutenants and associates within his organization moved to consolidate control over different pieces of his criminal enterprise, and the broader Brooklyn underworld, already fracturing along the same fault lines reshaping organized crime across the entire country during this period, absorbed and redistributed the territory and operations that Yale had once controlled. Within just a few years, the entire landscape of American organized crime would undergo another seismic transformation, as Prohibition itself approached its end, and as a new generation of criminal leaders, men who would go on to formalize and structure organized crime into the more centralized, commission-governed system that would define the mid-20th century American mafia, began to emerge from the chaos and violence of the 1920s. As for Al Capone, his own reign at the pinnacle of Chicago's criminal underworld, launched with such crucial early guidance from Frankie Yale, would prove considerably shorter than either man might have imagined during those formative years at the Harvard Inn. Federal investigators, unable to successfully prosecute Capone for the extraordinary litany of violent crimes attributed to his organization, including, most infamously, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, eventually succeeded in convicting him not for murder, not for bootlegging, but for tax evasion, a conviction in 1931 that sent him to federal prison and effectively ended his reign as one of the most powerful criminal figures in American history. Capone's health deteriorated significantly during his imprisonment, complicated by the effects of untreated syphilis, and he emerged from prison in 1939 a diminished, mentally compromised figure, a shadow of the calculating, ruthless organizational genius who had once eliminated his own mentor without hesitation when their interests diverged. He died in 1947 at his estate in Florida, having spent his final years largely removed from the criminal underworld that had once trembled at his name. There is a particular kind of tragedy that runs through this entire story, one that echoes across countless similar relationships throughout the history of organized crime, in Sicily, in New York, in Chicago, and beyond. The mentor who builds his own successor, who pours years of hard-won wisdom, protection, and genuine affection into a younger man's development, does so, whether consciously or not, at genuine risk to himself. Frankie Yale taught Al Capone everything: how to project calm authority in moments of crisis, how to balance strategic violence with genuine community goodwill, how to build lasting political and law enforcement protection, and, perhaps most consequentially, how to recognize when a relationship, however valuable it had once been, had become a liability that needed to be eliminated with the same cold, unsentimental efficiency that had built both of their respective empires in the first place. Capone absorbed every one of these lessons with extraordinary skill, and when the moment came, when his suspicions about hijacked liquor and political betrayal within the Unione Siciliana had accumulated to the point of certainty, he applied his mentor's own teachings against the man who had taught them to him, without hesitation, and, as far as the historical record shows, without lasting regret. Frankie Yale's story has, in many ways, been overshadowed in the popular imagination by the far more extensively documented and dramatized legend of Al Capone, a man whose flamboyant public persona, sensational trial, and long imprisonment at Alcatraz made him a fixture of American mythology in a way Yale, killed at just 35 and largely forgotten outside the pages of organized crime history, never became. But it is impossible to understand Capone's rise without understanding Yale's mentorship. It is impossible to understand the machine gun era of American gangland violence without understanding that quiet Sunday afternoon on 44th Street, when the tactic was born. And it is impossible to understand the true, cold arithmetic of loyalty in the criminal underworld without sitting, for a moment, with the image of a man gunned down by the very student he had raised, protected, and loved, killed not out of hatred, but out of the same ruthless, unsentimental logic he himself had spent a lifetime teaching. Frankie Yale built an empire out of nothing but nerve, patience, and an unerring understanding of human nature. He rose from a mountain village in Calabria to become one of the most powerful men in Brooklyn's history. And in the end, the very qualities that made him so effective a teacher, his willingness to eliminate any threat, no matter how personal, the moment it stopped serving him, were turned back against him by the one student who had learned those lessons better than anyone else alive. That is the story of the mentor who built a monster. And it is, in its own dark way, one of the truest stories the underworld has ever told about itself, that in a world built entirely on power, loyalty is never permanent. It is only ever borrowed, on interest, until the day it comes due. If this story moved you the way it moved me putting it together, do one thing for me before you go: hit subscribe. This channel is built on telling these forgotten, complicated, deeply human stories from the shadows of history, the ones that don't get the Hollywood treatment, buried in old newspaper archives and half-remembered court records. There are so many more stories like Frankie Yale's waiting to be told, and I'd love to have you with us for the next one. Thank you for walking through this story with me, from a boy on a ship crossing the Atlantic, to a king of Brooklyn, to a man riddled with bullets on a quiet summer afternoon. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows, like this video, subscribe for more tales from the underworld, and let me know in the comments which gangster story you want us to tell next. Until then, stay in the shadows with us.